So welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 16th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about internal migration in the United States and how swinging and movements from state to state might ultimately impact the 2024 election and give President Biden another 4-year term in the White House. What we have seen from Move Buddha, which does a number of different analysis points when it comes down to how people are moving from red states to blue states, from swing states to non-swing states, and into specific counties here, combined with an analysis that we see here from the Associated Press, the U.S. Census, that has been compiled together that takes a look at how swing state populations have changed since the 2020 presidential election. And with this combined, these combined data points, we come to a conclusion here that there is, in fact, what we would dub to be Democratic influx into these battleground states and how they could ultimately help Joe Biden win 3 crucial battleground states, but arguably help him all across the country. Now, what I'm most focused on is specific where we have seen the most growth in terms of counties from the 2020 election. You're talking about areas like Maricopa County and DeKalb County that are very much swing state counties that have swung states like Georgia and Arizona to the left, and how an influx in population there is consistent with what we saw from 2012 to 2016, from 2016 to 2020, that largely led for these states to become more and more Democratic compared to where they had voted in years past. That combined with the fact that we're looking at, just generally speaking, the 2024 presidential election from the perspective of swing states, which states are losing population, which states are gaining population, and what ultimately is important too is where people are coming from. So when you look at states like California, where there is an exodus of voters there going into other states, states like Texas and Florida, chances are people who are leaving California and going to Texas and Florida are not Democrats. But there is also reason to believe that voters who are moving out of more populous cities and more urban areas that are historically Democratic might be moving into other battleground states and making them more Democratic. And so we can unpack this arguably pretty long article here that has a number of key takeaways, and we'll really only focus the ones that are, important for this election. We'll also look at the swing state population growth. I will say I want to caution us when we look at a chart like this one that might seem overwhelmingly in favor of the Democratic Party in saying that what we're looking at here are counties that have voted for Biden and voted for Trump. And often the most populous counties are the ones that voted for President Biden. And so the numbers aren't as favorable as a chart like this might suggest, but they do reveal that voters are moving to blue counties. Voters are moving to Biden areas. And again, tracking that consistent trend line of many of these counties, many of the competitive ones, might I add, from 2012 to 2016 to 2020, we found in those 3 consistent years, a lot of the suburban regions that have now become blue counties, a lot of the outskirts of major cities, alongside a bunch of the urban areas where you see a lot of vote dumps for the Democratic Party. You're going to find that there's been a consistent trend in favor of Democrats, including 2022, and it actually should worry Republicans because we've seen a shoring up of Republican support in the rural regions. We'll get to this in a moment. In the rural regions, increased support in the urban regions for Democrats. So again, more people that move there, the more people that vote blue, the more likely it is that President Biden wins re-election. But let's go ahead and take a look at this article here first. Now, this is actually, not a political media company. This is not a news organization. This is actually just an organization that focuses primarily, it's a business that focuses primarily on moving. But they decided to take what they knew and what they understood, just the data that they get when it comes down to moving data, where Americans are going to and from, and they've used it to now pivot to the 2024 election. And so it's actually a unique use of data like this that we rarely ever see from private businesses, but it provides us a different lens to look at it, different from what the pundits might say, different from FiveThirtyEight, different from ABC News, different from a bunch of these different organizations. And so some of these key takeaways at the baseline here is that what they're primarily focused on are states like Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. And they're looking at what they call blue islands. That's what they dub them to be, the areas of Democratic strong support, right? So for example, when you're going into Arizona, you're talking about areas like Maricopa County, where 1 million out of the state's 3 million votes for in totality, that's where you saw 2 million of the state's 3 million votes in Arizona came from one individual county. When you're looking over at Nevada, you're talking areas like Clark County, which again accounts for the overwhelming majority of the state's vote. And so you're looking at all of these different parts of the country, all of these different parts of these states, and that's what they determined to be blue islands. They also look at just generally the migration patterns that we've seen, the electoral outcomes we might see because of that, the economic influence, the state level influence. So you're talking about what is happening on a statewide level, talking about restrictive bans on abortion. That might be a factor for why someone who is a Democrat might leave a state. You might also find that economic factors like raised taxes might be a reason a Republican leaves a state. So they're looking at different things too, combined with, of course, general things that we understand about migration, things about job growth, economic prosperity, opportunity. different things that impact why people get out of states and move into others. And so what they have found here is that red states are likely to strengthen their political base with economic growth. So, you're looking at states like Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. You're finding that a lot of tech companies are going to regions out in the middle of America, and that is bringing people in for jobs. And it is bringing in potentially economic benefits for people to move there. And so Republicans benefit when the economy does better. Republicans are often expected to be the best performing presidents, legislators, representatives when it comes down to on single issue economy. President Trump trounces President Biden on handling of the economy. He did so even back in 2020, and you even saw it in 2016. You saw it in 2012. The economy is typically what the Republican Party does best. And so it makes sense that when there are more economic opportunities, chances are Republicans are going to leave potentially blue states. They're going to leave potentially swing states and move into some of these more solidly conservative states. Now states like Florida, which used to be swing states, that have now become overwhelmingly conservative in a new era of COVID policy, a new era of economic policy, but it ultimately is pulling votes away from a swing state that otherwise could be voting for the Republican Party. And so these numbers here, combined with what we see on graphs like this one, show that population growth might be the only reason that President Biden wins re-election in 2024. What we know about the 2020 presidential is that many of these victories for President Biden simply could not have happened without consistent change in demographic in these battleground states. For instance, in a region like Georgia, in the southern region of the United States, Georgia is the prime move-to location outside of Florida and North Carolina. And that was a big bump for Democrats, because what we found here was that minority Americans were moving from states, even neighboring ones like South Carolina and Alabama and Mississippi, and moving into the Atlanta metro area. That, of course, was combined with a decrease in population that we saw in states like New York and California. Not necessarily a decreased population. When I say things like that, they aren't growing at the same rate as the national average, and so they lose electoral votes. And so you do find that some, minority Americans are moving out of these different parts of the country, solid blue states, solid red states, and moving to swing states. States like Georgia that made it conducive for a President Biden victory. Even if you were to swing the counties from 2012 to 2020, the populations in some of these counties wouldn't be there enough for President Biden to beat whatever would be, the demographics of the 2012 election. We would still see a Donald Trump victory if the map was similar to that. You have areas like Fulton County and DeKalb County and Cobb County and, all of these different parts of the Atlanta metro area that have gained in population, gained in Democratic support, and the shifts here are combined with just a natural move away from the Republican Party that we've seen among suburban Americans. And so it was a near perfect storm here that allowed President Biden and Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff to win the Senate races here, to win the presidential for the first time since 1992. And so putting that into perspective, everything must have gone right for Democrats in Georgia this time around, with an expansion in population that we are seeing specific to Georgia too. Republicans are gaining some growth in some Trump counties, but Democrats are also seeing it. And there are also some counties that are on the verge of being Trump in the Atlanta metro area that are now potentially going to be Biden counties. We saw some of them flip over in 2022. And the reason I point that out is because that's also an area of Georgia that you are seeing population growth in. And so it may be misleading in saying that they're moving to Trump counties, but in reality, you're talking about counties here that are in the urban sprawl, the suburban region of the Atlanta metro, that are becoming more Democratic because of these population growths. And so you see it in Georgia. They also mentioned the state of Arizona. You can see it in Maricopa County. This is getting a huge number of people moving into the state of Arizona. I mean, the net growth between 2020 and Maricopa County, nearly 400,000 new residents since the last election. Joe Biden won Joe Biden won across the state of Arizona by just 11,000 votes. And so to understand that nearly 400,000 new residents have moved into Arizona and moved into Maricopa County, well, I don't think 90% of them are Democrats. I don't think that number is going to be correct. And I don't even think we should expect to see a substantial majority of those voters being Democratic, but I do think there is a majority. And I do think that when those voters get into these counties, they get into these Democratic states, they get into states that are more pro-Biden, regions that are more pro-Biden, these are not the types of Republicans that are trying to escape what they call a California tax or escape what they find to be, liberal tyranny. Those types of people are moving to Texas. They're moving to Florida. They're moving to states where they believe their, liberties and their pursuits and whatever it might be are protected under Republican governance. And that is certainly not the state of Arizona. And so we can reasonably assume that where people are moving to, specific in states like Arizona and Georgia and Nevada, and especially if they're overwhelmingly just blue counties, chances are those people also lean to the left as well. And so President Biden is going to see that he is going to have to tackle on 400,000 new residents in Arizona from the 2020 election. Huge population growth there, huge boom. The Phoenix area is actually one of the largest growing metro areas in the entire country, and so it makes a lot of sense. But when we talk about demographic shifts from what we've seen over the past 10 years, it almost always benefits the Democratic Party, and I honestly think that these numbers reaffirm that as well. In the state of Nevada, too, this one is a bit more misleading because, similar to Arizona, we can't say that this is going to be what the graph might suggest, that it's overwhelmingly 90 to 10, 80 to 20, liberal versus conservative based on who's moving here, because most of the population, just as Arizona, lives in one county. And so keeping that in mind, we have to understand, too, Nevada is not a red state, right? They might have a Republican governor. The state legislature here is a Democratic supermajority, has some very, very Democratic ideals. The Democratic Party, after 2020, actually was taken over by much further left-wing actors in the state party. I mean, you talked about the Harry Reid machine that at one point collapsed after the 2020 election. You saw a huge influx of people who self-identified as socialist and communists taking over the Nevada Democratic Party, and which you have now since seen them ousted of party leadership. Democrats have seen a complete turnover in the state because arguably they cannot win on a strategy like that one, and they knew that when they were getting into it. The point being here, though, Nevada is not somehow this Republican safe haven. And so when you do find that there is a population increase, and President Biden already had that advantage back in 2020, this could be buffering it enough that if President Trump was to make inroads amongst Latino voters, was to make inroads amongst white Americans, would it be enough to counteract what would be just this built-up bench from simple population growth? Maybe not. And an election that comes down to the wire, comes down to just a fraction of a percentage point, just like the 2020 election. I mean, had the country shifted just 1 point to the right, you would have seen a victory for President Trump and another 4-year Trump term in the White House. And we'd be in an entirely separate situation for the 2024 election. And so looking at Nevada and, looking at this part, I will say, this is certainly going to be a very interesting thing to watch if population trends and population growth in these battleground states is enough to have President Biden survive in these battleground states. And it extends to other battleground states. North Carolina, though, is the only one that we have seen more growth in Trump counties than Democratic counties. And so that's also maybe the reason, besides what we know about the election, when we look at the polls, North Carolina is actually the most conservative swing state. And it makes a lot of sense. It is the only swing state that we were looking at, the top 7 here, that voted for Trump in the last election, but it might have been reaffirmed by some of this new population growth in Trump counties. But again, not a perfect metric, not a perfect factor. I think what we look at here when it comes down to different trends in terms of internal migration in the United States, it can go a variety of different ways. What I'm trying to do is try to visualize this for the 2024 election, what it might mean, what it might look like when it comes down to an electoral map. Nevada in a point of contention, Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. I mean, you can look at it here. Population growth in some of these Rust Belt states, though, has been very, very low. And I think that also might be a contributing factor as to why President Biden and his campaign feels more confident in that region, because they arguably know it the best. Wisconsin has seen less than 50,000 new residents move in after the 2020 election. You have Arizona, which has just one more electoral vote. Might I add, one more electoral vote than Wisconsin. Has nearly 10 times the amount of growth since the 2020 election. So in a 4-year span, less than 50,000 in Wisconsin. It might even be more than 10 times. 500,000 new people in Arizona. So just putting that into perspective, that the population growth in a lot of these other areas in the southern region of the United States, despite what the polls are telling us, because a lot of the times, the polls aren't working with actively updated metrics. A lot of new people into a region might not be polled, might not even have, their phone numbers in a database, whatever it might be. I mean, that's a whole separate question. The idea here, though, is that the reason why maybe President Biden does as well in the Rust Belt and why his campaign is more confident and is able to actually, hunger in that base and really bring it down to being a Democratic state, Democratic blue wall again, is because they know this region the best, because it has been the least changed since the last election. But I do think, in a way, Democrats should be optimistic that population growth in some of these southern states, in some of these more important areas like Nevada and Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina, that population growth there, especially in the Democratic counties, could allow them the perfect circumstance for another reelect or for a victory for President Biden in these states. It's not going to be something that comes easy. And voter persuasion and winning over independents and the same thing they did in 2020 will be absolutely necessary if they want any chance of winning it in 2024. But there is in no way rooted in any reality this idea that Democrats don't have the population growth to win in 2024. They have the movement in Arizona. They have the movement in Nevada. They have it in Georgia. And they can tackle that, and they can use it to ride it into victory if they do everything else correctly. Because right now, Donald Trump leads in these states. And everything from this point on will be about cutting down that lead and taking it over come Labor Day, come October, come November. Because by the time we reach the election, the demographic trends in these states do tell us, on one end, that President Biden absolutely can win. But it is on Democrats to harness that, tap into it, and make it effective for this election. And it will be a question of time if they are able to do so effectively. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.